Good morrow, scholars. Welcome back to Five Nights at Freddy's The Silver Eyes. In case there are people listening to this that don't listen to Twilight, and I can understand. Happy New Year. I hope it's a good year for you. I hope you had a good year last year. Before I waste any more time, Iggy, do you have anything you'd like to say to everyone? I didn't think so. Alright. Thud, thud, thud. Charlie, startled, out of sleep, disoriented. Something was banging on her door, trying to force its way in. "Oh, for goodness sake," Jessica said grumpily, and Charlie blinked and sat up. Right, the motel. Hurricane. Someone was knocking on the door. As Jessica went to answer the door, Charlie got out of bed and looked at the clock. It was 10 a.m. I hate days like that. She looked out the window at the bright new day. She had slept worse than usual, not nightmares, but dark dreams she could not quite remember. Things that stuck with her, just beyond the back of her mind, images that she could not catch. Charlie, someone was screeching. Charlie went to the door and found herself immediately enveloped in a hug. Marla's plump arms gripping her like a vice. Charlie hugged her back tighter than she meant to. When Marla let go, she stepped back, grinning. Marla's moods had always been so intense they were contagious, spreading out to whoever was in her path. When she was gloomy, a path fell over all her friends. The sun shone behind her. The sun gone behind her cloud. There we go. When she was happy like now, it was impossible to avoid the lift of her joy. She was always breathless, always slightly scattered, always giving the impression that she was running late, though she almost never was. Marla was wearing a loose, dark red blouse, and it suited her well, setting off her fair skin and dark brown hair. Why does everybody seem to have brown hair? I guess it is the most common. Is it? I don't even know. Charlie had kept in better touch with Marla than the others. Marla was the type who made it easy to stay friends even at a distance. Even as a little kid, she was always sending letters and postcards, undeterred if Charlie didn't respond to everyone. She was resolutely positive and assumed that everyone liked her unless they made it clear otherwise, using the proper expletives. Charlie admired it about her. She herself, though not shy, was always calculating. Does that person like me? Are they just being polite? How do people tell the difference? Marla had come to visit her once when they were 12. She had charmed Charlie's aunt and made fast friends with her school friends while still making it abundantly clear that she was Charlie's friend, and she was there only to see Charlie. Oh, that's good. My friends don't do that for me. Hang on one sec. Beep. Beep. Now I'm just ahead. Uh-oh. That's way too far. Sorry, I just like to mess around with things. Yeah, that works. Where was I? Marla's gigantic smile turned serious as she studied Charlie, peering at her as if trying to spot the differences since they last met. You're as pale as ever. Why is every protagonist pale? Fine then, don't answer.
Oh, were you addressing me?
No. Yes. Everybody.
Because it's a bit more, I guess, ominous.
I guess so.
Fair skin.
I guess. Although, if you ask fair-skinned people, they'd say dark-skinned people would be more ominous. Let's not get into racism. Not today. Where was I? She took Charlie's hand in her own, and "You're all clammy. Don't you ever get warm?" She dropped Charlie's hands and proceeded to study the motel room skeptically, as though uncertain exactly what it was. "It's a luxury suite," Jessica said without expression, as she searched for something in her bag. Her hair was sticking up in all directions, and Charlie stifled a smile. It was nice to see something about Jessica in disarray for once. Jessica found her hairbrush and held it up triumphantly. "Ha! Take that, morning frizz." "Come on in," Charlie said, realizing she and Marla were still in the doorway, the door wide open. Marla nodded. "One sec, Jason!" she shouted out the door. No one emerged. "Jason!" A young boy came trotting up from the road. He was short and wiry, darker skinned than his half-sister. His Batman t-shirt, yeah. I have a Batman t-shirt, I just put it in the closet. Wait a minute. And black shorts were made for someone twice his size. His hair was cut close to his head, and his arms and legs were streaked with dirt. Were you playing in the road? Marla demanded. No, he said. Yes, you were. Don't do that. If you get yourself killed, Mom's going to blame me. Get inside. Marla shoved her little brother inside and shook her head. How old are you now? Charlie asked. 11, and Jason said. He went to the TV and started fiddling with the buttons. Jason, stop it, Marla said. Play with your action figures. I'm not a little kid, he said. Anyway, they're in the car. Oh, I need to find my Five Nights at Freddy's t-shirts for when I read these. And by these, I mean these chapters. I don't know anymore. What was I doing? But he stepped away from the television and went to look out the window. Marla rubbed her eyes. We just got here. We had to leave at 6 this morning, and someone, she said pointedly, glancing over her shoulder at Jason, wouldn't stop fiddling with the radio. I am so tired. She didn't seem tired, but then she never did. At their sleepovers as kids, Charlie remembered her bouncing around like a maniac while the rest of them were winding down for the night, then falling asleep abruptly, like a cartoon character who'd been hit over the head with a rolling pin. We should get ready, Jessica said. We're supposed to meet the guys at the diner in an hour. Hurry, Marla said. We have to change too. I didn't want to get all gross while we were driving. Jason, you can watch TV, Charlie said, and he looked at Marla. She nodded, and he grinned and turned it on, starting to flip through channels. Please just pick a channel, Marla said. Charlie headed into the bathroom to get dressed while Jessica fussed with her hair. A little less than an hour later, they pulled into the diner parking lot. The others were already there, in the same booth they'd been in the night before. When they got inside, Marla performed a second round of squeals and hugs, only slightly quieter now that they were in public. Overshadowed by her enthusiasm, Lamar stood and waved at Jessica and Charlie, waiting until Marla sat down. I missed something. Hi, guys, he said at last. He was wearing a dark tie and a dark gray suit. He was tall and thin, black, with his hair shaved close to his head. His features were sharp and attractive, and he looked just a little older than the rest of them. It could have been the suit, but Charlie thought it was something about the way he stood, holding himself like he would be comfortable wherever he was. They had all dressed up a little for the ceremony. Marla had changed at the motel, and she and Jessica were both wearing dresses. Jessica's was knee-length and covered in pastel flowers, a light fabric that moved as she walked. Marla's was simple, white with big sunflowers splashed over it. Charlie hadn't thought to bring a dress, and she hoped she didn't look out of place in black pants and a white button-down shirt. John was wearing a light purple shirt today, though he'd added a matching tie in a slightly darker color, and Carlton seemed to be wearing an identical outfit as before. Still all in black, they all sat down. Well, don't we all look nice, Marla said happily. Where's Jason? Jessica craned her head from side to side. Marla groaned, I'll be right back. She scooted out of the booth and hurried out the door. Lamar, what have you been up to? Charlie asked. Lamar grinned. He's an Ivy League man, Carlton said, teasing. Lamar looked briefly down at the table, but he was smiling. Early acceptance was all he said. Which one? Jessica said, Cornell. Why is it always Cornell? Ivy League for everyone. Wait, how did you already apply to college? Charlie said. That's not till next year. I don't even know where I want to go. He skipped 6th grade, John said. There was a brief flicker of something across his face, and Charlie knew what it was. John liked being the clever one, the precocious one. Lamar had been kind of a goof-off when they were kids, and now he had leapt ahead. John forced a grin, and the moment passed. Congratulations, he said, with no hint that it was not entirely sincere. Marla came bursting in again, this time towing Jason behind her, holding onto his upper arm. At the hotel, she made him change as well into a blazer and khakis, though he was still wearing his Nikes. I'm coming, stop it, he whined. Is that Jason? Carlton said. Yeah, Jason said. Do you remember me? Carlton said. I don't remember any of you, Jason said unapologetically. Sit there, Marla said, pointing to the next booth over. Okay, he grumbled. Marla, he can sit with us, Jessica said. Jason, come on over. I want to sit here, he said, and sat down behind them. He pulled a video game out of his pocket and was oblivious to the world. The waitress came over and they ordered. Marla told her to put Jason's breakfast on their check. Their food came. Charlie checked her watch. We don't have a lot of time, she said. We'll get there, Carlton said. It's not fair. A small piece of food fell out of his mouth as he gestured far down the road. Have you been back to the school? Lamar asked, and Carlton shrugged. I pass it sometimes. I know this is a nostalgia trip for all of you, but I just live here. I don't exactly go around reminiscing about kindergarten all the time. They were all quiet for a second, the beeps and pings of Jason's video game filling the silence. Hey, did you know Lamar's going to Cornell next year? Jessica said to Marla. Really? Well, aren't you ahead of the pack, she said. He looked down at his plate. When he looked up, he was a little flushed. All part of the 5-year plan, he said. They laughed, and he blushed, and his blush deepened. It's kind of weird to be back here, he said, hastily changing the subject. I think it's strange that I'm the only one who still lives here, Carlton said. Nobody ever leaves Hurricane. Is it strange, though? Jessica said thoughtfully. My parents, you remember, my mom's from New York originally. She used to joke about going back. When I go back to New York, but it might as well have been when I win the lottery. She didn't mean it. And then right after, she stopped joking about it. Then 3 months later, we were all on a plane to visit her sister in Queens, and we never came back. My dad's father died when I was 9, and then came back to Hurricane for the funeral without me. They didn't want me coming back here, and honestly, I didn't want to go. I was kind of anxious the whole time they were gone. I kept looking out the window, hoping they would be back early, like something bad was going to happen if they stayed. I was like that, too, as a child. Why is it so dark? I guess I could open the window. Where was I? They looked at each other, considering Charlie knew they had all moved, all but Carlton. But she had never thought about it. People moved all the time. Carlton was right, though. People didn't leave Hurricane. We moved because my dad got a new job the summer after 3rd grade, John said. That's not exactly mysterious, Lamar. You left in the middle of the semester that year. Yeah, he said, but that's because when my parents split, I went with my mom in Indianapolis, he frowned. But my dad moved too. He's in Chicago now. My parents left because of Michael, Marla said. They all turned to her. Afterward, my mom couldn't sleep. She said spirits were stirring in the town, unquiet. My dad told her she was being ridiculous, but we still left as fast as we could. Marla looked around at her friends. What? She said defensively. I don't believe in ghosts. I do, Charlie said. She felt like she was talking from a great distance. She was almost surprised they could hear her. I mean, not ghosts, but memories. I think they linger, whether there's someone there or not. The house, her old house, was imbued with memory, with loss, with longing. It hung in the air like humidity. The walls were saturated, like the wood had soaked it in. It had been there before she came, and it was there now, and it would be there forever. It had to be. There was too much, too great and vast a weight for Charlie to have brought it with her. That doesn't make any sense, Jessica said. Memories in our brains, like literally stored in the brain. You can see it on a scan. It can't exist outside of someone's mind. I don't know, John said. Think of all the places that have atmosphere. Old houses, sometimes places where you walk in, and you feel sad or nostalgic, even though you've never been there before. That's not other people's memories, though, Lamar said. That's subconscious cues, stuff we don't realize we're noticing, that tells us we should feel some way. Peeling paint, old-fashioned furniture, lace curtains, details that tell us to be nostalgic. Mostly things we pick up from movies, probably. I got lost at a carnival when I was 4. I never got so scared in my life, but I don't think anybody's feeling suddenly desperate for their mom when they pass that Ferris wheel. Maybe they are, Marla said. I don't know. Sometimes I have little moments I feel like there's something I forgot, something I regret, or that I'm happy about, or something that makes me want to cry. But it's only there for a split second, then it's gone. Maybe we're all shedding our fear and regret and hope everywhere we go, and we're catching up traces of people we've never met. Maybe it's everywhere. How is that different from believing in ghosts? Lamar asked. It's totally different, Marla said. It's not supernatural, and it's not like the souls of dead people. It's just people leaving their mark on the world. So it's the ghosts of living people, Lamar said. No, you're talking about people having some kind of essence that can hang around a specific place after the person is gone. Lamar said, that's a ghost. No, it's not. I'm not saying it right, Marla said. She closed her eyes for a minute, thinking. Okay, she said at last, do you all remember my grandmother? I mean, a ghost is more like their consciousness than anything else. Let's not get into it. He's oversimplifying it, and he's wrong. I do, said Jason. She was my grandmother, too. She was my dad's mom, not yours, Marla said. Anyway, you were only a year old when she died. I do remember her, Jason said quietly. Okay, Marla said. So she collected dolls from the time she was a kid. She and my grandmother used to travel a lot after... grandfather used to travel a lot after he retired, and she'd bring them back from all over the world. She had them from France, Egypt, Italy, Brazil, China, everywhere. My mom did that with her father, my grandfather. And it was full of them, shelves and shelves of dolls, some tiny, some almost as big as I was. I loved it. One of my earliest memories is playing in the room with the dolls. I remember my dad would always warn me to be careful, and my grandmother would laugh and say toys should be played with. I had a favorite, a 12-inch red-haired doll in a short, shiny white dress like Shirley Temple. I called her Maggie. She was from the 1940s, and I loved her. I told her everything, and when I was lonely, I would imagine myself in that room playing with Maggie. My grandmother died when I was 6, and when my dad and I went to see my grandfather after the funeral, he told me I should pick a doll to keep from the collection. I went to the room to get Maggie, and as soon as I walked through the door, something was wrong. It was as though the light had changed, something darker, harsher than it used to be. I looked around, and the lively, playful poses of the dolls now seemed unnatural, disjointed. It was as though all of them were staring at me. I didn't know what they wanted. Maggie was in the corner, and I took a step toward her, then stopped. I met her eyes, and instead of painted glass, I saw a stranger. I turned and ran. I raced down the hall as though something might be chasing me, not daring to look back until I reached my father's side. He asked if I had picked a doll, and I just shook my head. I never went back in that room. Everyone was silent. Charlie was transfixed, still seeing the little Marla running for her life. What happened to the dolls? Carlton asked, only half breaking the spell. I don't know. I think my mom sold them to another collector when my grandfather died, Marla said. That's sad. Sorry, Marla, Lamar said. It's just tricks of the mind. You missed your grandmother, you were frightened of death, and dolls are inherently freaky. Charlie broke in, wanting to head off the argument. Is everybody done eating? We have to go soon. We still have plenty of time, Carlton said, looking down at his watch. It's like 5 minutes away. Something else fell out of his mouth, landing next to the first drop bit of food. Really? John looked around the table from person to person as though he were waiting for something. We have to tell them, he said, looking at Charlie. Oh yeah, we totally do, Jessica said. Tell us what? Jason piped up, peeking over the back of Marla's seat. Shh, Marla said half-heartedly. She was looking at John. Tell us what? John dropped his voice, forcing everyone to lean in closer. Charlie did it too, eager to hear, even though she knew exactly what he was going to say. We went to Freddy's last night, he said. Freddy's is still there? Marla exclaimed, too loud. Shh, Jessica said, making frantic hand movements. Sorry, Marla whispered. I can't believe it's still there. It's not, Carlton said, raising his eyebrows and grinning enigmatically at Lamar. It's hidden, John explained. Yeah. They were supposed to knock it down to build a mall, but they didn't. They just built around it. Entombed it, John corrected. And you got in, Lamar said. Charlie nodded, confirmation. No way. What was it like? Marla asked. Exactly the same, John said. It's like everyone vanished, Charlie said softly. I want to go too. You have to take us, Marla said. Jessica cleared her throat hesitantly, and they all looked at her. I don't know, she said. I mean, today? Should we? We have to see it, Lamar said. You can't tell us this and not let us see it. Yeah. I want to see it, Jason chimed. What's Freddy's? They ignored him. His eyes were wide, and he was hanging on to every word. Maybe Jessica's right, John said with reluctance. Maybe it's disrespectful to go tonight. There was a moment's pause, and Charlie knew they were waiting for her to talk. She was the one they were really afraid of offending. They needed her permission. I think we should go, she said. I don't think it's disrespectful. It's almost a way of honoring what happened. She looked around the table. Jessica was nodding. Charlie wasn't sure it was much of an argument, but they didn't need to be convinced. They wanted an excuse. Marla twisted herself to look at Jason's plate. Are you done eating? She asked. Yep, he said. Marla pointed at the game in his hand. You know you can't play that during the ceremony, she said. Yep. I'm serious, Jason. I'm locking it in the car. Why don't you just lock me in the car? He muttered. I'd love to, Marla said under her breath as she turned back to the group. Okay, we can go. They headed to the school in a caravan, the boys in Carlton's car, Marla following, and Charlie bringing up the rear. We should have carpooled, Jessica said idly, staring out the window. It hadn't occurred to Charlie. I guess, she said. On the other hand, I'm not sure I want to ride with Marla and Jason, Jessica said plainly. They are kind of intense, Charlie agreed. When they arrived, the parking lot was already jammed full. Charlie parked on a side street in what she hoped was a legal spot, and they walked to the school along the familiar sidewalk. Jessica shivered. I've got goosebumps. I love that series. It's weird to be here, Charlie said. The school looked unchanged from the outside, but the fence was new and slick, a black plastic-coated chain link. That's weird. The whole town was like this, a mix of old and new, familiar and not. The things that had changed seemed out of place, and the things that had remained the same made Charlie feel out of place. It must be so strange for Carlton to live here, she thought. This is a nostalgia trip for you, but I just live here, he had said. Somehow Charlie was not sure she believed that. When they got to the playing field behind the school, the bleachers were already full. Rows of folding chairs had been laid out in front of them to add more seating, and Charlie spotted Marla and the boys on the front. Oh, great, she said. I don't want to sit in the front row. I don't mind, Jessica said. Charlie looked at her. Of course you don't, she wanted to say. You're you. Yeah, she said instead. No big deal. Sorry. Half the town must be here. Wait, what? I think I missed the spot. Yeah, she said instead. No big deal. Half the town must be here, she observed as they made their way to the group. I don't know where I was. And now I lost my place again. As they made their way to the group where 2 seats had been saved, there was one open in the front row, one next to Carlton, one right behind it, beside Marla. Jessica winked at Charlie and sat down next to Carlton. She leaned toward him, and they started whispering. Charlie repeated herself to Marla. There's a lot of people here. Yeah, Marla said. I mean, it's a small town, you know. It was a big deal. Plus, his parents still live here. People remember. People remember, Charlie echoed softly. There was a small, raised stage set up in front of them with a podium and 4 chairs. Yikes. We're already over 20 minutes. I still got like 20 pages to go. Where was I? Behind the chairs, a screen was suspended. Projected on it was a larger-than-life picture of Michael. It was a close-up, just his face. It was not the most flattering picture. His head was thrown back at an odd angle, his mouth open in laughter, but it was perfect. A joyful moment, snatched up and kept, not curated. He looked happy. Darn it, Marla said softly. Charlie looked at her. She was dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. Charlie put an arm around her. I know, she said. The sound system came on suddenly with a whine that slowly faded. 4 people walked on stage, a heavy-set man in a suit who went straight to the microphone, an elderly woman, and a couple, a man and a woman. Or a man and a man, or a woman and a woman. I don't judge. The man in the suit stepped up to the podium, and the elderly woman sat down in one of the 4 chairs. The couple stayed back, but they did not sit. Charlie knew they must be Michael's parents, but she did not recognize them. When she was young, they had just been parents, a species that was for the most part unremarkable. She realized suddenly that she didn't even know their names. Michael's parents had not gone out of their way to interact with their son's friends, and Charlie had literally spoken to them as Michael's mom and Michael's dad, as if those were appropriate forms of address. The man at the podium introduced himself as the school's principal. He had said a few things about loss and community and the fleeting preciousness of youth. He talked briefly about Michael's kindness, his artistic talent, and the impression he made, even as a small child, on everyone he met. It was true, Charlie reflected. Michael had been an unusually charismatic child. He wasn't exactly a leader, but they all found themselves wanting to please him, to make him smile, and so they did often things they knew he wanted to do just to make him happy. I wish people wanted to make me happy. The principal finished and introduced Michael's parents, Joan and Donald Brooks. Mel Brooks. They stood at the podium awkwardly, each looking from face to face in the crowd as if they were not sure how they had gotten here. Finally, Joan stepped forward. It feels strange to be up here, was the first thing she said, and a murmur of something like agreement swept quietly through the crowd. Darn it, the murmurs. We are so grateful to all of you for coming, especially those of you who came from out of town. She looked directly at the front row, talking to Charlie and the others. Some of Michael's friends have come from all over, and I think that is a testament to who he was, that 10 years later, with our lives on new paths, moving on to a whole new stage of life. She was so close to the stage, Charlie could see she was about to cry. Tears were wavering in her eyes, but her voice was steady. We are grateful you are here. We wanted to give Michael a legacy with this scholarship, but it is clear that he has already left one all on his own. Marla grabbed Charlie's hand, and Charlie squeezed back. I want to say, Joan continued, something about the families who are not here. As we all know, Michael was not the only child lost during those terrible few months. She read out 4 more names, 2 boys and 2 girls. Charlie glanced at Marla. They all knew there had been other children, but Michael's death had loomed so great in their lives that they had never really even talked about the other victims. Now Charlie felt a pang of guilt. To someone, those little girls and boys had been as vital as Michael. To someone, their losses had meant the end of the world. She closed her eyes for a moment. I can't mourn everyone, she thought. No one can. I can sure try. Wait. This takes place in 1995. I'm almost certain. 10 years before. 1985. The Fazbear and Friends thing in 1983. The Bite of 87. I feel like we're getting somewhere with everything, and I can't wait to figure it out. Joan was still thinking. So in about 85, 5 kids were already gone. Dead, essentially. One of the security guards you play as is named Mike. Could Michael be the... No, he couldn't be the crying child. Joan was still talking. Although their families have moved on to other places, those young boys and girls will always have a place in our hearts. Now I would like to call to speak to a young man who was particularly close to my son. Carlton, if you would. They all watched in surprise as Carlton stood and climbed up behind the podium. Joan hugged him tightly and stayed close behind him as he pulled a crumpled piece of paper from his pocket. He cleared his throat, looking over the heads of the crowds, then crumpled the paper up again and put it back in his pocket. I don't remember much about Michael as I should. He said finally. Too much of those years is a blur. I know we met when we were still in diapers, but I don't remember that, thankfully. There was a soft titter through the crowd. I do know that as far back as I have memories, Michael is in them. I remember playing superheroes, drawing, which he was much better at than me. And as we got older, I remember, well, playing superheroes and drawing. What I really remember, though, is that my days were always more exciting when he was in them. He was smarter than I. He was the one always coming up with new ideas, new ways to get in trouble. Sorry about those lamps, by the way, Mrs. Brooks. If I had jumped the way Michael said, I probably would have only broken one. Donald laughed, a gulping, desperate sound. Charlie shifted uncomfortably and pulled her hand from Marla's with an apologetic half-smile. Their grief, naked, was too much to watch. It was raw, an open wound, and she could not stand to look. Carlton came back to sit down with them. Michael's grandmother spoke, and then his father, who had recovered enough to share a memory of taking his son to his first art class. He told the crowd about the scholarship for a graduating senior who has demonstrated both excellence and passion in the arts, and announced the winner of the first one, Anne Park, a slight Vietnamese girl who came up quickly to the stage to accept her plaque and hugs from Michael's parents. It must have been strange for Anne, Charlie thought, her honor so overshadowed by its origins. But then she realized Anne must have known Michael too, however much in passing. After the ceremony, they went to say hello to Michael's parents, hugging them and making sounds of condolence. What do you say to someone who has lost a child? Can it be any easier? Can 10 years make a difference? Or do they wake up each morning as fresh with grief as the day he died? On a long cafeteria table by the stage, pictures and cards were collecting slowly. People had brought flowers, notes to Michael's parents or to him. Things they remembered, things they wished they had said. Charlie went over and browsed through them. There were pictures of her and the others, as well as of Michael. It shouldn't have surprised her. They were all together constantly as a group or in rotating groups of 2 and 3. She saw herself in the middle of a smiling pose, Michael, and John all covered in mud, with Jessica beside them. Still perfectly clean, refusing to go near them. Charlie smiled. That looks about right. And another, a 5-year-old Marla, struggled to support the weight of her newborn little brother, with Lamar peering suspiciously at the tiny thing over her shoulder. Some of Michael's drawings were there too, crayon scribbles, professionally and congruously framed. Charlie picked one up, a drawing of what she supposed was a T-Rex stomping through a city. It was actually, she realized now, almost amazing how talented he was. While she and the others were scribbling stick figures, Michael's drawings looked realistic, sort of. That's really good, John said over her shoulder. Charlie startled. You scared me, she said. Sorry. Charlie looked back at the drawing. Whatever it was better than she could draw now. Suddenly her chest tightened, gripped with loss and rage. It wasn't just that Michael died young. It was what that truly meant. He had been stopped in his tracks. Years, decades of life snatched and torn violently from him, more than they realized. She felt herself well up with youthful indignation, as if she were a child again, wanting only to whine. It's not fair. Taking a deep breath, Charlie set the picture back down on the table and turned away. The gathering was continuing, but she needed to leave. She caught Marla's eye, and Marla, as scarily intuitive as always, just nodded and caught Lamar's sleeve. From their various vantage points, they all headed for the parking lot. No one seemed to notice their departure, which made sense, except for Carlton. They were all strangers here. In the lot, they stopped by Marla's car. She had someone called down a miracle and found a space right next to the school. "Can I play my game now?" Jason said immediately, and Marla found her keys in her purse and handed them over. "Don't drive away," she warned. Suddenly Marla grabbed her brother and pulled him close, hugging him to her for a long minute. "Geez, I'm only going to the car," he muttered when she let him go. "Yeah, maybe I should let you drive away," she said, giving him a little push. She cleared her throat. "So are we going to Freddy's?" she said. They all looked at one another. "Yeah," Charlie said. "I think we should. Somehow, following this, going back to Freddy's seemed like more than a game. It felt right. Let's meet here or there at 10. She said. "Hey, Jessica, can you catch a ride with the guys or something? I'm going to go for a walk." "You can come with us. I promised Jason I'd take him to the movies." "I want to go to the movies. Let's go see Star Wars." Anyway, Charlie headed down the road without waiting to hear the rest of the discussion. A dozen feet from the lot, she realized she was being followed. She turned around. "John, do you mind if I come?" "Yeah, you're going to your old house, right? How did you know that?" "That's the only interesting thing out this way. Anyway, I went to see my old place too. It was painted blue and there was a garden in the yard. It was weird. I know it wasn't blue when I lived there, but I couldn't remember what color it's supposed to be. Everything is so different." "I have that problem too." Charlie didn't say anything. She wasn't sure she wanted John to come with her. Her house, her father's house, it was private. She thought of the first time John had seen the toys, his fascination, an interest that was all his, that had nothing to do with pleasing her. She relented. "Okay, you can come." "Is it," he hesitated, "is it different?" "It's not really," Charlie said. It wasn't quite true, but she wasn't sure how to explain the thing that had changed. They walked together for the better part of 3 miles, away from town and down the old roads, first paved, then gravel. And they neared the place they left, the roads ascending the steep incline of a hill overrun with brush and trees that should have been trimmed or cut down ages ago. 3 rooftops peeked over the leaves, scattered widely over the hill, but no one had lived in these houses in a long time. At last they walked up the driveway, and John stopped short, staring up at the house. "I thought it would be less intimidating," he said softly. Impatient, Charlie took his arm for a second and pulled him away, leading them around the side of the house. It was one thing for him to be here with her, but she was not quite ready to let someone inside. She was not quite sure she wanted to go inside again anyway. He followed her without protest, as if aware that they were in her territory and she would decide where they went. The property was large, more than a lawn. There were woods surrounding the wide space of the backyard, and as a child Charlie had often felt like she was in her own little realm, ruler of all she surveyed. The grass had gone wild, weeds growing feral up to their knees. They walked the perimeter. John peered into the woods, and Charlie was struck by her old childhood fear, like something out of a fairy tale. "Don't go into the woods alone, Charlotte," her father warned. It was not sinister, just a parent's warning. Don't get lost. Like telling her not to cross the street without holding someone's hand, or not to touch the stove when it was hot. But Charlie took it more seriously. She knew from her storybooks, as all children did, that the woods contained wolves and more dangerous things. She caught John's sleeves. "Don't," she said, and pulled him back from the woods, not asking why. Instead, he went to the tree in the middle of the yard and put a hand on it. "Remember that tree?" he grinned, something a little wicked in his voice. "Of course," Charlie said, walking over. "It's been there longer than I ever was." But he was looking at her, waiting for more, and suddenly she remembered. It had been a sunny day, springtime. They were 6 years old, maybe. John was visiting, and they were playing hide-and-seek, half supervised by Charlie's father, who was in his garage workshop, absorbed in his machines. The door was open so he would notice if someone screamed, but short of that, the outdoors were their own. John counted to 10, his eyes covered, facing the tree that was home base. The yard was wide and open. There were not many places to hide, so Charlie, buoyed up by the excitement of the game, dared to hide beyond the forbidden edge of the woods, just barely past the tree line. John searched the other places first, behind her father's car, in the corner where part of the garage jutted out, the space beneath the porch where a child could just barely crawl. He realized where she must be, and Charlie braced herself to run as he began to walk the edges of the yard, darting into the woods and out again, looking behind trees. When at last he found her, she took off, tearing across the lawn to the home base tree just behind her, so close he could almost touch her, and she sped on, staying just out of reach. She hit the tree, almost slamming into it, and John was right behind her, bumping into her a second later, too fast to stop. They were both giggling hysterically, and then they stopped at the same moment, still gasping to catch the breath. "Hey, Charlotte," John said, stressing her name in the mocking tone he always used. "Don't call me that," Charlie said automatically. "You ever see grown-ups kiss?" "Why?" He picked up a stick and started digging at the tree bark. "I've done that before." Like he was more interested in that than in her answer. Charlie shrugged. "Yeah, I guess I want to try it." He still wasn't looking at her. His face was streaked with dirt, like it often was, and his hair was sticking out in all directions. A twig caught in above his forehead. Caught in it. There we go. "Gross," Charlie said, wrinkling her nose. Then, after a moment, "Yeah, okay." John dropped the stick and leaned toward her, his hands behind his back. Charlie closed her eyes, waiting, still not entirely sure what she was supposed to do. "Charlotte!" It was her father. Charlie jumped back. John's face was so close to hers that she banged into him with her forehead. "Ow!" he yelled, clapping a hand to his nose. Charlie's father came around the side of the tree. "What are you up to, John?" He pried John's fingers away from his nose. "You're not bleeding. You'll be fine," he said. "Charlotte, closer to the house, please." Then he pointed his finger, directing them forward. "John, it looks like your mom is here anyway." He walked ahead of them toward the driveway where the car had just pulled in. "Yeah, okay." John trotted off toward the driveway, turning once to wave at Charlie. He was grinning like something wonderful had happened, though Charlie was not quite sure what it was. "Oh my," Charlie said now, covering her face. Sure, it was bright red. When she looked up again, John was grinning the same satisfied 6-year-old grin. "You know, my nose still hurts when it rains," he said, touching a finger to it. "It does not," Charlie said. She leaned back against the tree. "I can't believe you tried to kiss me. We were 6, Charlie stared at him accusingly. "Even the littlest heart wants what it wants," John said in a mock romantic voice, but there was an edge of something real in it, something not well enough hidden. Charlie realized suddenly that he was standing very close to her. "Let's go see your dad's workshop," John said abruptly, too loud, and Charlie nodded. Okay, she regretted it as soon as she said it. She did not want to open the workshop door. She closed her eyes, still leaning against the tree. She could still see it. It was all she could see when she thought of that place. The twitching, malformed metal skeleton in its dark corner, with its wrenching shutters and its blistering silver eyes. The image welled up inside her head until it was all there was. The memory radiated a cutting anguish, but she did not know who it belonged to the thing, to her father, or to herself. Charlie felt the hand on her shoulder and opened her eyes. It was John, frowning at her like he was worried. "Charlie, are you okay?" "No." "Yes," she said. "Come on, let's go see what's in the workshop." It was not locked, and there was no real reason it should be, Charlie thought. Her eyes went first to the dark corner. The figure was not there. There was a weathered apron hanging in its place, the one her father had worn for soldering, and his goggles next to it, but there was no sign of that uncanny presence. Charlie should have felt relief, but she didn't, only a vague sense of unease. She looked around. There seemed to be almost nothing left of the workshop. The benches were there, where her father had assembled and tweaked his inventions. But the materials, the blueprints, and the half-finished robots that were once crammed into every surface had disappeared. Where are they? Had her aunt had them carted away to a junkyard to rust and crumble among other discarded, useless things? Or had her father done it himself so no one else would have to? The concrete floor was littered here and there with scraps. Whoever had done the cleanup had not been thorough. Charlie knelt and picked up an oddly shaped scrap of wood, then a small circuit board. She turned it over. Whose brain were you, she wondered, but it did not matter, not really. It was battered and worn and edged copper too badly scratched to repair, even if someone wanted to. What did I say? I don't know. "Charlie," John said from across the workshop. He was in the dark corner. If the skeleton had been there, it could have reached out to touch him. But it's not there. What? Come see what I found. Charlie went. John was standing beside her father's toolbox, and he stepped away as she came over, giving her space. Charlie knelt down before it. It looked as if it had just been polished. It was made of dark stained wood, glossy with some kind of lacquer. Oh, sounds pretty. She opened it gently. Charlie picked up an awl from the top tray and held it for a moment, the rounded wooden handle fitting into the palm of her hand as if it had been made for her use. Not that she knew how. The last time she had picked it up, she could barely fit her fingers around its base. She picked up the tools one after another, lifting them from their places. The toolbox had wooden spaces carved out to fit the precise shape of each item. All the tools were polished and clean, their wooden handles smooth and their metal unrusted. They had looked as though they had just been used that morning, wiped down and put away meticulously, like someone still cared for them. She looked at them with a fierce, unexpected joy, as if something she had fought for was returned to her. But her joy felt wrong, misplaced. Looking at her father's things set her off balance. Something in the world was not as it should be. Seized suddenly with an unfounded fear, she thrust the awl back into its place in the box, dropping it like something burning. She closed the lid, but she did not stand. Memory overtook her, and she closed her eyes, not fighting against it. Her feet were wedged in the dirt, and two large calloused hands covered her eyes. Suddenly there was a bright light, and Charlie squinted, squirming impatiently to see what was before her. 3 complete and gleaming figures towered over her, motionless, the sun reflecting off every edge and contour. They were blinding to behold. "What do you think?" She heard the question, but could not answer it. Her eyes hadn't adjusted. The 3 masses of standing metal all looked similar in structure, but Charlie had grown accustomed to seeing more than what was there, imagining the final result. For a long time now there had been 3 empty suits hanging like carcasses from a rafter in the attic. Charlie knew that they had a special purpose, and now she understood what it was. 2 long beams protruded from the top of the head of one of the hulking masses. The head itself was solid and skull-like. The beams looked as if they had been violently thrust there. "That's the rabbit," Charlie squealed, proud of herself. "Aren't you scared of him?" the voice asked. "Of course not. He looks like Theodore." "Theodore, that's right." Because Scott was most terrified of Bonnie. The figure in the middle was clearly more rendered. Its face was chiseled, its features distinct. It was clearly a bear, and a single metal beam stuck out from the top of his head as well. Shirley was puzzled for a moment, then smiled. "For the top hat," she said, with confidence. The last form was perhaps the most frightening. A long metal clamp protruded from its empty face, in the place where a mouth might go. It was holding something on a platter, a metal structure that looked like a jaw, wires running like strewn spaghetti up and down the metal frame, in and out of its sockets. "That one's scary," she admitted hesitantly. "Well, this part will look like a cupcake." Her father pressed down on the top, and the jaw snapped shut, making Charlie jump, then giggle. Suddenly her laughter stopped. She had been so distracted she'd forgotten. "I'm not supposed to stand here. I don't stand here." Her hands were trembling. How could she have forgotten? The corner. She looked around. She looked at the ground, unable to lift her eyes, unable to move. One of her shoes was untied. There was a screw next to her foot, and an old piece of tape, opaque with dirt. There was something behind her. "Charlie?" It was John. "Charlie?" She looked up at him. "Sorry, just lost. This place." She stood and took a step forward, positioning herself in the place she remembered. She glanced behind her as if the memory might manifest. The corner was empty. There was nothing. She knelt again and put her hand on the ground, fishing around until she found a small screw in the bare dirt. She palmed it, then looked closer. There were small holes in the ground, exposed when she moved the loose dirt. Charlie ran her fingers over them, thoughtful. "Charlie, I have to tell you something." There was something urgent in John's voice. Charlie looked around the workshop and stood up. "Can we go outside?" she said. "I can't breathe in here." "Yeah, of course," he said. He followed her out into the yard and back to the hide-and-seek tree. She was tired, a wrung-out exhaustion deep inside. She would be fine in a minute, but she wanted a place that held only silly childhood memories. She sat down in the grass, leaned against the trunk, and waited for John to talk. He settled himself cross-legged in front of her, a little stiffy, smoothing his pants, and she laughed. "Are you that worried about getting dirty?" "Times change," he said with a wry smile. "What do you have to tell me?" she asked. His face grew serious. "I should have said something a long time ago," he said. When something happens like that, you don't trust your memory. You don't trust your own mind." "What are you talking about?" Charlie asked. "Sorry." He took a deep breath. "I saw someone that night, the night Michael disappeared." What do you mean? Remember when we were sitting by the table, or at the table by the stage, and the animal started going crazy? I remember, Charlie said. It had been bizarre. Their movements upsetting. They were moving too fast, bending and spinning, cycling through their limited programmed moves over and over. They seemed frantic, panicked. Charlie was mesmerized. She should have been afraid of them, but she was not. She saw in their juddering motion a kind of desperation. She was reminded for a moment of dreams of running, dreams when the world depended on her going just 10 steps forward, yet her body could only move in slow motion. Something was wrong, terribly wrong, chaotically, violently. The animatronic animals on stage thrashed robotic limbs in all directions, their eyes rolling in their sockets. What did you see? Charlie said to John now, shaking her head as though she could rid it of the image. There was another mascot, he said. A bear. Freddy, Charlie said, interrupted without thinking. No, not Freddy. John took her hands as if trying to calm them both, but he let go before he spoke again. It was standing right near us, next to our table, but it wasn't looking at the stage like everyone else was. That technician came over, remember? And even he was just watching the animatronics. I guess he was trying to figure out what was happening. I looked over at the mascot, and it looked back at me. He stopped. John, what? Charlie said, impatient. Then the animatronics on the stage stopped moving, and I looked over at them. And they were all turned back around. Michael was gone, and so was the mascot. Charlie stared at him in disbelief. You saw the kidnapper? She said. I don't know what I saw, John said. It was all chaos. I didn't even think about it. I didn't make the connection. It was just another animal at Freddy's. I didn't think about who might have been inside. I was a kid, you know. You figure that the grown-ups already know everything you know. Yeah, Charlie said. I know. Do you remember anything? What the person looked like? John was staring up at the sky as if he were seeing something Charlie could not. Yes, he said. His voice was deliberate, steady. The eyes, they were all I could see. But I still see them sometimes, like they're right there in front of me. They were dead. What? They were dead, just dull and flat, like they still moved and blinked and saw, but whatever was behind them had died a long time ago. He fell silent. It was growing dark. There was a bright, almost unnatural streak of pink across the western sky, and Charlie shivered. We should go get the car, she said. It's almost time to meet everyone. Yeah, John said, but he didn't move right away, still staring into the distance. John, we have to go, Charlie said. He seemed to come back to himself slowly. Yeah, he said, we should go. He got up and brushed off his pants, then grinned at Charlie. Race you, he said, and took off running. Charlie chased after him, her feet pounding the asphalt and her arms swinging free. Okay. Whoa. Whoa. Whoa, that's a lot to absorb. I'm going to go lie down. You guys have a great day and Happy New Year. I think I said that 3 times now. Until next time. Goodbye, everybody. Let me know what you found. Wow, I have a big head.